Hello, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast. Get HazCom and GHS right, from deadlines and training to SDS, labeling, and beyond, sponsored by Brady Corporation. My name is Kyle Morrison. I'm the Senior Associate Editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you for joining us. We'll start the presentation in a few minutes, but first I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. The views of the speakers and their organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorse them. At the end of today's webcast, we'll have a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click the Submit Question button. You may feel free to ask your question at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, but due to the large number of participants today, we may not get to all of the questions. However, any unanswered question will be forwarded on to today's speakers. For basic troubleshooting information, please click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived for 3 months, so you can access it after today's live presentation. Within about a day, just use the same URL to return to the webcast. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to begin. We have 2 speakers joining us today. Tom Smith is the Regional Product Marketing Specialist at Brady, and he has more than 20 years of experience developing product solution and tools for multiple markets. Scott Stone is Brady's Client Services Safety Solution Owner and has 15 years of experience in building safety management systems and inspection auditing processes. Tom?
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Great introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning if you're on the East Coast, and good afternoon if you're on the West Coast. We are Central Time, so it's right over our lunch hour. So feel free, grab a coffee or a Mountain Dew if you're in the afternoon, and feel free to settle in. We're going to plan on presenting about 40 minutes to 45 minutes between Scott and myself to try to leave enough time for your questions at the end. So with that, why don't we get started? I'm going to push to the next slide, and you should see some of the things that we're going to discuss over the next few minutes, which is the biggest challenges with GHS for employers. We'll touch on some of those. We'll refresh the OSHA timeline. We'll drill down on the importance of training. Scott's really going to touch on that. I'll talk about the hazard classification, but then really drill down on the labeling options for you. We'll sprinkle in some best practices as well, and then we'll wrap up with some industry questions as well as some Q&A from the audience. So, given that, let's talk about the biggest changes. First are the labels. They look completely different. There are 2 different types of labels, and the requirements for each are slightly different. OSHA calls one a shipped label and the other a workplace label. There have been a lot of questions surrounding these label requirements and what the minimums are, how to print them, what's required, etc. So we'll clear that up. SDS Sheets represents another big change. It's 16 sections of mandatory information. There's lots of questions on whether to keep hard copy SDSs, how to manage that transition, whether to house them in-house, electronically, use an online provider, etc. So we'll touch on that too. One of the questions that I do get occasionally is how long to keep the MSDSs. The common response is about 30 years. However, remember, it doesn't have to be the MSDS sheets. OSHA requires you to keep some record of the identity of the chemical to which employees are exposed for 30 years, and the easiest way is usually the MSDS sheet. So training is another one. About 16 months ago, the December training deadline has passed. However, because HazCom GHS update is considered a performance standard, there's a greater burden placed on the employer to ensure employees understand the hazards they're working with. Under the 1983 HazCom terminology, the right to know was kind of understood to mean giving employees access to information. Under GHS, however, it takes on a new meaning, making sure workers understand the hazards of the chemicals they're dealing with, as well as the information contained in the SDS sheets. And this is commonly referred to as the right to understand. So where previously an OSHA inspector or compliance officer may have come into your facility and said, show me where your MSDSs are, now they may come into that facility and ask one of your employees, what does that exclamation point mean? on that acetone container? What's the impact if you spill that, et cetera? So a much different scenario than before. And the hazard classification criteria has also changed. The NFPA Diamond and the HMIS system that we were familiar with had 4 hazard categories with 4 colors. GHS only has 2 broad hazard categories, health hazards and physical hazards. And the chart that you're seeing at the right is from the OSHA HazCom appendix, which helps chemical manufacturers and formulators and mixers help classify their chemicals, in this case the flammable fluids category, into various levels of severity based on its flash point. All right, so in terms of the timeline, you should be familiar with the timeline and these milestones. 15 days ago, we passed the deadline by which chemical manufacturers and importers must begin labeling their chemicals with the new GHS labels. You should begin seeing these as well as the SDS sheets now in your facility. So now would be a good time to consider refreshing the training, as well as having a method to manage your SDS information, whether you maintain these in binders or you maintain them electronically. The last critical date is June 1, 2016, when all users of chemicals, including my company, who we use a lot of inks and adhesives, must be in full compliance. And then for any of our Canadian customers to the north, WMIS 2015 was recently published. It's similar to GHS in most respects. The implementation is over a 3-year time period. It will be synchronized nationally across the federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions. Their end date is a little bit farther out. It's December 1st, 2018, when all parties have to comply with the amended, what Canada calls HPR, or the Hazardous Product Regulations. All right, so where is the industry today? At our last National Safety Council show, awareness was high. A lot of people had heard about GHS. We had solid booth traffic when we were there. With many companies who use chemicals are now beginning to search for compliance solutions. They had heard of GHS, and now they're looking for what can they do to comply. So our focus with this webinar is to give you some practical tips and practical solutions for implementing this within your facility. If you do a quick Google search of SDS sheets for common chemicals like isopropyl alcohol or sodium hydroxide, you'll find about 70% of them have already been updated with the SDS information. The sheer number of chemicals, however, and I believe there's about 950,000 in the U.S. that require classification, that's been a daunting challenge for chemical manufacturers. Based on some secondary research we did, and this is about 6 months ago, it included a survey of over about 200 chemical manufacturers. At that time, a little over half, or 55%, were currently authoring new GHS-compliant SDSs. About 28% had not at that time, but were planning to, and then 17% didn't respond. For mixers and blenders and reformulators and folks like production labs, the June 1st deadline is particularly problematic because they're supposed to be authoring their new GHS labels and SDS sheets now, and if their upstream chemical supplier didn't have until June 1 to comply, how are they supposed to comply by the same date? So OSHA did respond to that. They indicated that they will deal with it on the enforcement side rather than modify the HazCom compliance dates. So if those companies are using and can demonstrate what OSHA calls reasonable diligence and good faith efforts to obtain the necessary information, OSHA will not issue citations or fines during their inspections. I'll touch on what that means in just a couple of minutes. Here's a couple of items that we outlined in terms of a checklist that you generally should have completed by now, given that we're about 2/3 of the way through OSHA's GHS timeline. Not to worry, because you still have time to be in full compliance, but these things include a plan of action, right? So by now we should have formulated that action plan. Who's responsible, what budget resources are needed, what facilities and areas are affected. You should do an inventory of your chemicals, how you're going to transition, and then who and when the overall HazCom program will be updated. Who's responsible for updating it, and when is it going to be updated? Training on how to interpret the pictograms, their meanings, and how to read and interpret SDS sheets. And because the initial training the deadline was 18 months ago, the best practice is to reinforce that information with things like posters, signs, any information hung near where the chemicals are stored, even employee wallet cards, as well as periodic retraining to reinforce that. And I think Scott will touch on this as well. Also, an audit of chemicals in your facilities. How many chemicals do you have and where they're located? This helps identify the scope of your labeling needs as well as provides a reference point for follow-up completion audits. Separate your MSDS sheets from your SDS sheets. This provides a visual method for understanding which chemicals have changed versus those which haven't yet within your inventory. Binders are a good way to keep track of hard copies for emergencies and first responders. And you should also be reviewing your existing HazCom program for where you're going to amend that to update with the new GHS requirements. It's also a good idea to reach out to your suppliers, your chemical suppliers, and kind of obtain their status with regard to GHS labels and SDS sheets. It helps kind of establish that first step in using reasonable diligence if you are unable to comply due to your upstream supplier. And then lastly, have a strategy for accomplishing how you're going to relabel your chemicals internally or in the secondary containers. Know approximately how many labels you're going to need, whether you're going to print the labels yourself, order them from a supplier, who's responsible for labeling your containers or your secondary containers, and who's going to replace damaged, defaced labels, and how are they going to do that. So we should have some kind of an idea at this point of who you want to take on those tasks. All right, so training and retraining. Don't underestimate the importance of adequate training. I'll turn it over to Scott in a second, but know that we're moving from an area where having our employees simply know where to get chemical information to having our employees interpret and understand the hazards of the chemicals they work with. So it's kind of going from the what's and where's to the how's, who's, and why's. Simply handing an employee the SDS sheet, unfortunately, doesn't comply anymore. So to dig a little bit deeper into this, I'm going to turn it over to our resident safety expert, Mr. Scott Stone. Scott, you there?
I am. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, we put extra emphasis on training during this webinar just because it's such a crucial component of a successful hazard communication process. I'll talk about some of the general requirements from a training standpoint, some common mistakes made out there in the industry, and recommendations that you can use to get started or to refine your current training strategy that you have. But before I jump into my slides, I'd like to discuss a situation I was involved with that demonstrates when a company kind of misses the mark when we talk about training. My previous career, I used to work in safety for the last 15 years, but I worked for an outsourced maintenance company where we did outsourced maintenance for a lot of big companies around the U.S. and around the globe. And one site that we were working at, OSHA showed up for an investigation at the site we were working, and the investigation was not on the company I was with, but for the customer. But, of course, we get pulled in to the investigation because they said, hey, who are you, different hat, and, we get pulled in the investigation. But while on the walk-around, the compliance officer noticed an unlabeled secondary container that was in a different repair area where another contractor had responsibility for. It was actually a forklift repair area. The compliance officer proceeded to ask the employee in that area that was working about the identity of the contents in that container. So after that question was asked, the employee stated that he wasn't exactly sure what was in that container, proceeded to dip his finger in the solution, tasted it, and said, oh, that's the cleaning solution I use. So training is definitely an issue there. Employee not familiar with the hazards associated with the chemical. There's a big disconnect there. You definitely don't want to be in that situation. So that was just one personal experience that I've had talking about hazard communication and training. Some other things, HazCom, compliance related, it did come in at number 2 on the OSHA's top 10 most frequently cited standards, and the top section cited was employee information and training. So they are definitely looking at that when they come on site. So what does OSHA require? Talking to the slide now, employers are required to provide employees with effective information and training on hazardous chemicals in their work area at the time of their initial assignment, and whenever a new physical or health hazard that employees have not previously been trained on is introduced in their workplace. And some of the new verbiage now, instead of saying new physical or health hazard, it's actually a chemical hazard. So I've highlighted some key words on that slide. The first one is effective. This means that the information and training program must work. Employees must carry the knowledge from the training into their daily jobs. For example, if they're, Tom talked about it, if OSHA comes into the work area, they should know the chemicals that they're working with. They should know the hazards associated with those chemicals. They should know how to protect themselves. They should know where the SDSs are located. They're going to ask those questions. It is a performance standard. They need to have that knowledge to effectively and safely perform their jobs. Work area, next highlighted word, it means just what it says. The information and training must be specific to the work area. You can't stop training, just on the general hazards. You see this a lot out there where it's an online training or it's a video or it's a generic PowerPoint that's done once a year, and it's hazard communication. It talks about the regulations and all that, but it doesn't talk about the specific chemicals that those employees are going to be interacting with on a day-to-day basis. That training needs to be geared towards that level of detail with what they're exposed to in their work area. So that's a big mistake that I see. Initial assignment, new employees. Training is definitely required for those new employees, and they must be informed and trained before going on the job. And again, that's back to the job-specific hazard that they're faced with in their work area. And then new physical or health hazard or new chemical hazard. Sometimes new hazardous chemicals are introduced in the workplace, and sometimes employees are assigned to new jobs that involve potential exposure to new hazards. So there should be a system. You should have a methodology on site that triggers, whenever a new hazard comes in or a new chemical comes in. I'll talk a little bit about a review process for that, but also employees that are going from site to site, going from a work area to work area that has different hazards present with the chemicals that they're working with there. So that's definitely another trigger for training. Slide 9. Thank you. Inform and train employees on any operations in the work area where hazardous chemicals are present. This phrase points again to the need to be specific in information in the training program. Generalities about operations have no relevance. These specific, the specific hazards have to be covered. The location, availability, and details of the written hazard communication program. This includes the required list of hazardous chemicals and safety data sheets. The HazCom program, they need to have access to that. It's their right to get access to that, to read it when they want. It should be specific. If it's kept in Building A in the supervisor's office, that area should be available at all times. It should be available at off shifts. It should be available to all the employees. So they need to know exactly where it is and how to gain access to that. Also have to inform them and train them on the methods and observations that may be used to detect the presence or the release of a hazardous chemical in the work area. So if there is a release, how do they know? Some chemicals, such as chlorine, there's an odor, ammonia, certain unique properties that they need to be aware. Hey, if you smell this, there's a release. You need to follow these emergency procedures. So that also has to be cleared. The hazards of chemicals in the work area, we've talked about that. These hazards, it includes the physical health, simple asphyxiation, combustible dust, pyrophoric gas hazards, and the stuff that's not otherwise classified. And then the last bullet on there, the measures employees can take to protect themselves from these hazards. And these can include everything from learning the meaning of emergency signals out there in case of a release, no entry signs, and then really the correct PPE, the last line of a defense there on what they need to be using and wearing to protect themselves from those hazards. And there's a lot of different tools that are out there that can help you identify these things, get out in the work site and work with these employees side by side. But tools such as the job hazard analysis, that's a great tool to use. PPE hazard assessment that OSHA requires, that should be active in a living document on site. Then industrial hygiene monitoring is another one. All right, question: how do you find out how effective your training is? And it's really easy. The best way to ensure that your employees have the proper knowledge and understanding of the chemicals they work with is to ask. If a compliance officer or someone comes in, that's what they're going to do. They're going to go out there and ask. If you're curious about, I wonder how good my training is, I wonder if my training is effective, go out there and ask them. Get out in the field and talk with your employees. That is by far the best way to gauge that understanding of those employees out there working in the field. So some common mistakes that I've seen, I've talked about some of these a little bit, but checking the box attitude when it comes to training. Hey, as long as everything's green on our dashboard, we got 100% of our employees trained, we're good to go. But do they have the understanding? Are you using a very generic, training? Are you using a generic PowerPoint or a generic online training system? Is it not getting down to that task-specific, that work area where those employees are exposed to that certain chemical hazard? So checking the box, just, hey, we're 100% up the chain. Everyone feels good. You got to be aware of that. Training is not hazard location specific. One size fits all. Talked about that. One size does not fit all. Inappropriate training method. Tom talked about it. You just can't hand an SDS to an employee and say, here you go, you're trained. It needs to be specific. SDS availability or no evaluation of effectiveness. And again, the best way is to ask. But even the training, yes, it should be specific and all that, but there should be a way to gauge their level of understanding. So trainings must have a question and answer component to it. There can be, testing and all that available that to gauge that effectiveness. Inventory outdated. This is a very common one. This can be a bear to keep up to date. I'm sure everyone out there on the webinar that's in charge of the chemical inventories there on site know how difficult that can be. So they can definitely easily become outdated, but that is very important to stay on top of, to know what you have on site and when new hazards are introduced. SDS availability is another one. I know the transitioning between MSDS and SDS is going on now, but out of date really, not keeping them up to date, not having that match the inventory, not having it by work area can be a problem. And then inadequate chemical requisition process. New hazards introduced. I see this a lot where you have different contractors coming in on site. They're bringing in their chemicals. We got the maintenance team that they're doing their own thing. They're bringing their own chemicals. You have an R&D team. They're doing their own thing. They're bringing in their own chemicals. That all has to be pulled together into a standardized process. So we're making sure that we're reviewing every chemical that's coming in to make sure that's added to the inventory. We're getting the SDS, making sure no new hazards are introduced. If they are, we're getting the appropriate training down to the appropriate employees. And just because no incidents have occurred or no compliance issues doesn't mean everything's okay. You need to be aware of complacency. You could just be getting lucky. You could have employees out there exposed every day, and they're just getting lucky. It just takes 1 second for someone's life to change forever. So just because everything feels good now and we haven't had any issues does not mean that everything's okay. You really need to go out there and do your due diligence to verify to make sure it is okay. So take the time to review your current state. And then where to start? The chemical inventory, great place to start. Tom talked about it a little bit, but you need to have, you need to be spot on with your chemical inventory. Even with the location that the material is used, because that's going to help you build your training around those specific hazards based on where those chemicals are located. SDS management, they need to be readily accessible. Binders in the work area, computers in the work area, they can't be locked somewhere in an EHS office, just from 8 to 5. They're available, or it's a computer station that's in a different building that you don't have a passcode to unlock the computer. They need to be readily accessible by those employees, near their work area. Chemical storage and distribution, purchase only chemicals in the amount required. You reduce your inventories and continue to review and purge obsolete chemicals. Get that stuff out of your plants that you're no longer using that you don't need. The review approval process, again, to touch on that, you need a robust system in place to ensure new hazards are appropriately identified. You're updating your chemical inventory, and you're getting that training communicated down to those employees that are exposed to that chemical. Work reviews. This is, again, getting out there and interacting with your employees to see what they're exposed to. This is a great aid, one, to increase your understanding and to make sure the employees have the right training and they're protected in the right way. And again, that job hazard analysis is a great tool to go out there, one, to find out what they're doing, identify any risk, unnecessary risk, or too high of a risk that they're exposed to, and put control measures in place to reduce that risk. And customized training based on those hazards, and then employee reviews is that last bullet there. And this is a big one. I include in here, leadership engagement and employee participation. Leadership being visible out on the floor. Safety committee involvement, employee engagement. Out there identifying hazards, identifying improvement opportunities, and really being their brothers and sisters keepers. So to have that engagement, across all level of employees out there in the workplace is going to get you where you need to be. So. Back to you, Tom.
All right. Thanks, Scott. That was great. And I think because GHS is so big and broad, and because it's affecting so many different things, and there's a lot of moving parts over, extended timeline, I think you've hit on the point as to why it's really important to reinforce and retrain where possible, and dig deeper below just making sure where the SDS sheets are to really understanding what you're dealing with. So I think that was great, Scott. Thanks. I appreciate that. So what I want to touch on now is just a little bit more of the implementation side of GHS. So classifying your chemicals. I've seen questions from companies who view themselves as intermediaries or distributors, kind of between the raw chemical supplier, say a manufacturer like a DuPont or BASF, and the end user who is consuming or using that chemical end product. They may combine mixtures and chemicals and redistribute those to other distributors or end customers. Companies like this who produce paints or coatings fall into this category, as do production laboratories selling to other labs or hospitals. From OSHA's perspective, as quoted in a recent memo from, I think, May 29th of this year, in quotes, some businesses repackage, blend, or mix hazardous chemicals, but consider themselves to be distributors in the supply chain. Under HCS, however, under the Hazard Communication System, they are considered manufacturers. So because of that, those companies are responsible for classifying their mixtures and blends and providing labels and SDS sheets for their customers. So if you're in that boat, if you're one of those companies, how do you do this? Right? So OSHA provides some guidance in their appendices to 1910-1200. One, you can use available test data for that mixture if available. GHS does not include the requirement for testing, but if that test data is not available, you can use these other things called bridging principles, which I'll touch on that in a second, but it's using test data from individual substances to help you classify that mixture, and there's about 6 bridging principles that you can use. And then lastly, if neither of those work, you can estimate the hazard based on known ingredient information. Here, OSHA says if test data is not available for the mixture itself and the available information is not sufficient to allow application of the above-mentioned bridging principles, then the method described in each chapter for estimating the hazards, and this is in the appendices, will be applied to classify the mixture. So there you can use things like cutoff values and concentration limits. So, for example, from the OSHA tables in Appendix, I think it's 2.4, if you have a liquid containing an acid, and that acid has a pH level of less than or equal to 2, and has a concentration within the mixture of greater than 1%, then it would be classified as a Category 1 skin corrosive, and that then gives you the identity to which to put the appropriate pictograms on it, as well as to classify that within your SDS sheet. So I mentioned the bridging principles, and I won't go into depth at all on this. It's kind of a wordy slide, and I don't want to go through it, but just note that there are 6 principles that are mentioned, from dilution to batching to concentration of the mixtures, interpolation, etc. Dilution, for example, is where a tested mixture is diluted with a less than or equally hazardous ingredient. there the classification would be based on the original tested mixture. Batching is where two batches or mixtures are produced under the same conditions, then both would have the same classification. I think you get the idea. I won't go through the rest, but it's really meant to use all available information to make an informed choice for accurate classification. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about labeling. So for the moment, let's assume that your chemicals are classified and that you are receiving chemicals, perhaps with the new GHS labels from your suppliers and the SDS sheets. What do we need to do when it comes to labels? Well, OSHA considers two types of labels under HazCom 1910.1200, GHS rule. The primary shipped container label, this is the container coming from the chemical manufacturers. So, for example, if we purchase a gallon of acetone from use in making either plastics or adhesives, and that gallon must have a GHS label on it with 6 specific elements. So it's got to have the chemical identifier name, the signal word, and the signal word is either danger or warning, the hazard pictograms, the hazard statements, precautionary statements, and manufacturer contact information. The layout can be up to you. OSHA doesn't tell you how to make the label. They just tell you what has to go on it. You can have additional information on that label as well. You can put the PPE required, whether it's safety glasses or hard hats. You can also put the NFPA or HMIS information on that label as well. The main thing is it can't conflict with the GHS information, and the GHS information has to be there. If that label does become lost or defaced or the information is no longer legible, then it's really us as the employer's responsibility to replace that label with a new one. The label on the right is what OSHA calls a workplace label. This is when you remove, let's say, some or all of the contents from that hazardous chemical primary container and place it into another container in the workplace. So let's, for example, your primary container might be a 55-gallon drum, but your secondary containers are 5-gallon jugs filled from that drum, and let's say you use those to fill different machines. The secondary container, 5-gallon jug, must also have a label on it called a workplace label, but the requirements, however, from OSHA are not as prescriptive. Here, OSHA says you can use all of the information contained on that primary label, or you can kind of continue using your 1994 HazCom right-to-know information like the NFPA diamond or HMIS color bars, or words, pictures, symbols, or a combination thereof, which, in combination with the other information immediately available to employees, provides the specific information regarding the hazards of that chemical. So more latitude as well, but the best practice, however, is making sure that your secondary container label matches the primary container, because that helps reduce any potential confusion and eliminates having to train on and understand both systems. All right, so you may be asking, well, how does this affect, let's say, the NFPA 704 standard, which is really the NFPA diamond? Well, the NFPA 704 is the identification of hazards of materials for emergency response. The NFPA Technical Committee on Classification will continue to assess the impact of GHS incorporation into the 2012 standard, but in the meantime, they have no immediate plan to change the existing NFPA 704 system, so the diamonds will continue to be in existence. The committee recognizes, however, that the NFPA 704 consensus standard has been protecting folks like emergency responders, employees, and the public for over 50 years, so any changes that they're going to make, they know have to be carefully considered. The next published update for NFPA is 2017. So one area that you might want to consider using both, let's say, the GHS and the NFPA diamonds or the HMIS color bars is like large tanks, large storage containers where you've got lots of chemicals in there. It's primarily so first responders at a glance can immediately see the hazard within that tank, and because they're so used to seeing the NFPA diamond or the HMIG color bars, it's probably a good idea to continue maintaining that identification on those containers as well. All right, so I'm not going to go through this. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the pictograms since we had to train on them earlier. Just note that there is a total of 9 pictograms. It's divided into 3 groups, physical hazards, health hazards, and environmental hazards. And because OSHA doesn't control the environment, that's really controlled by the EPA, OSHA does not control that one hazard element or pictogram. But don't get tripped up, because some of these pictograms look pretty similar. So if you look at the flammable gases and the oxidizing gases, both use a flame, but the oxidizing gases is a flame over a circle, and know that oxidizing gases have higher concentrations of oxygen, more so than the normal atmosphere, and can burn much faster and react more violently with combustible materials and are more difficult to put out or extinguish. So an example of a combustible or an oxidizing gas is chlorine gas, for example. Burns very, very fast. Okay, so what about small containers? A lot of questions have come up on how to handle the labeling in particular for small containers. 5-milliliter vials, tubes, ampules, small bottles, and beakers, especially when the hazard and precautionary statements now with GHS can be quite lengthy. So for primary shipped labels on those vials and tubes, OSHA says to use fold-back labels, pull-out labels, or tags. Chemical users must be able to read the labels without the use of any device, with the exception of corrective lenses like the glasses that I'm wearing, or for employees whose vision requires corrective lenses. If tags are used, they must be attached so that they do not become separated from the container. So they are stressing that you continue to try to provide all of that information, those 6 elements, on that small container where possible. But in June of 2013, they issued a letter for small containers like this that provided a practical accommodation for manufacturers who can show that it's not feasible to use fold-back labels, pull-out tags, pull-out labels, etc. That practical accommodation is that the immediate container must contain, at a minimum, these items that I've got in red: the product identifier, i.e. the chemical name, the pictograms, the manufacturer's name and phone, the signal word, and a statement indicating that the full label information is located on the outside of the package. And that outer package must contain the full information with all those 6 elements. So they do give you a little bit of an out in that you can provide some of the information, but the rest of it has to be on the outside container, and you have to maintain those small containers within that outside container as well. All right. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about shipping, the transportation labels? And you may have noticed that the DOT pictograms already look identical to the GHS pictograms. Well, that's because the Department of Transportation harmonized with GHS in 2008. When the primary container is also the shipping container, the simplest approach is to use both labels. So in this case, you've got what looks to be like a 55-gallon drum. Oftentimes the DOT label, there's size requirements as to how big that placard has to be. And so it's best practices right now just to use both the GHS label and the DOT label on the same drum. So when OSHA came out with this standard, they had something in the appendix referencing the DOT labels. They indicated that if the DOT pictogram appears, the corresponding GHS pictogram should not appear. However, when the standard came out, the DOT said, hey, we don't really see a conflict with this. And so OSHA came back and said, okay, both pictograms will be allowed. So OSHA is going to go back and revise that statement in the appendix and allow for the same pictograms to be on the DOT placard as well as on the GHS label. Okay, so let's talk about the additional label requirements. You can have multiple languages on the label, and it might be a good idea if your workforce is fluent largely in another language. Just know that it will increase the size of your label, but the label has to be in English. That's the first requirement. If you elect to print your own labels, look for software that gives you the option to add additional languages or select additional languages and print the label in English or Spanish or French or one of the other additional languages. Also, I think I had seen a question on a LinkedIn GHS group chat about the background color of the label. Does it need to be white? The OSHA standard does not specify a background label color except for the pictograms. The pictograms must be black on a white background with a red diamond on a set point. So as I previously mentioned, you can add supplementary information, and here we're showing the HMIS color bars to this label. This particular sign happens to be I think it's a tank sign for ethanol. A bigger sign, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 10 by 14, 12 by 18 size. So it's you can fit all of that information on there, and it's easy to read. But you can add that information on that sign as well. So just be aware of that. Okay. So what are my labeling options? We have essentially a couple of options. Whether you're needing primary or secondary container labels, you typically have about two options. One, you can order pre-printed labels from your label supplier. They can print what you need and then send them to you. Some companies may charge by the quantity for custom labels, others don't. Some may have setup fees, others may not. This option is usually good if you only need a fairly low volume or low number of labels, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, you need an extremely high volume of labels. But you can wait several days, or up to a week to receive them. The second option is if you want to print your own labels, and this is generally where you have two additional options. One, you could buy off-the-shelf label stock and print them using an inkjet printer from your PC. You will also have to find some GHS label templates as well in the software. But the key here is to find a template with software that has all the key fields preloaded, so you don't have to type everything in by hand, which can be very cumbersome, especially when you look at the length of the hazard and precautionary statements. Also, if you're an industrial facility that needs labels to last, the paper or more consumer-type labels that you'd get with an inkjet printer may not be as durable as you require, especially since these are going on chemical containers. So the other option is to purchase some type of an industrial label printer. The label quality as well as the label options will be greater. Often these use a different technology called thermal transfer, thermal heat transfer. The durability is going to be superior, and you've got the convenience of printing them as you need them and when you need them. So there's no waiting for shipping. So printing on your own labels has a big advantage in terms of time and convenience. So as Scott mentioned earlier about your inventory, taking an inventory of your chemicals, that's a good time to identify your labeling needs for those chemicals as well, and whether you need just a few labels or you're going to need, let's say, several hundred. So let's take a look at the relative label cost to see, what options make the most sense. Here, you can see that it's really volume dependent, and I'm using a 4 by 6 inch vinyl label as an example. If you have very low volume, let's say less than 100 labels a year or maybe up to 500 labels a year, it's kind of difficult to justify buying a printing system. Here, ordering pre-printed labels, which can cost you upwards of about $1.50 to $3 or more per label, depending on the source, is probably your best option. These can be commercially printed on equipment made for lower volumes and higher flexibility or customization. Pre-printed labels are also most cost-effective when you're needing really, really high volumes of labels, let's say in the thousands of labels or tens of thousands of labels. Because flexographic printing is high speed, it's kind of like when you used to see the old movies with the printing presses going and showing the newspapers running across these rollers. That's kind of what flexographic printing is. And so you get a lot of labels, it's relatively high speed, and it's relatively cheap to print each label. So, for example, a 4 by 6 label out of vinyl may cost you as low as like 30 cents or 75 cents. So print your own or print-on-demand printing systems are really designed to bridge this gap and provide users with a cost-effective approach and greatest flexibility and immediacy. So if you're a facility that needs to print upwards of 1,000 to several thousand labels a year, this is probably going to be one of the best options. The label cost will run somewhere around $1, 75 cents to $1.50 a label, and you have a wide range of options when it comes to printers. I didn't factor in the cost of the printer in this analysis because typically the printers will vary in price and features, and oftentimes they can print all different types of labels, not just GHS labels. So the investment can be amortized over applications beyond GHS, like arc flash labels, lean 5S labels, general safety and warning labels, bin labels, pipe labels, floor marking labels, inventory labels, barcode labels. I could go on, but there's tons of opportunities within the facility for labeling. And depending on the printer, some can also handle larger labels up to 10 inches. So if you elect to print your own, look for these things. Look for software that provides an easy, streamlined interface. With lengthy GHS hazard and precautionary statements, look for software that has those statements built in. You don't want to physically type all of that information. Look for the option to walk up and print or connect to your PC if you prefer that method. And look for the ability to easily save and store your frequently printed labels. Look for cloud-based capability as well, so you can kind of store, retrieve, and print anywhere within your facility or between your facilities. And as you guys know, when it comes to safety, the easier, more foolproof you can make it for your employees, the greater your chances are of success. You can also recall that the GHS shipped labels require red diamonds. So you may also need to be able to print in multiple colors. That means if you want to print your own, you're going to need to do one of three things with a color printer. Either purchase a printer that can print multiple colors, which is usually a little bit more expensive, but also provides you greater flexibility because now you can print things like danger, warning labels, caution labels, color-coded inventory labels, etc., and you don't need to keep separate label or template stock of that. You can just use multiple print colors on a white label. So depending on the size, some of these printers can also print large signs like door signs. So when you're evaluating whether or not to bring in a printer like this for your facility, just know that there are lots of options that you can use them for well beyond the GHS labels. What if, let's say the other option is if you don't want the multicolor printer, there is a one-color printer option out there as well. You can purchase a monochrome printer and purchase all the separate rolls of labels that have pre-printed red diamonds on them. These printers are usually lower in cost. Some have keyboards and touchscreens built in so you can walk up and print. Others will connect to your PC. The drawback is slightly less flexibility, meaning you may have to stock a few extra rolls of labels if you want to print GHS labels as well as, let's say, danger or warning labels. Also, I forgot to mention regarding the software, OSHA does give you the flexibility to black out the diamonds you're not using. Therefore, look for software that allows this option, as that will help you keep the number of templates or label rolls you need to stock to a minimum. Or you can use, lastly, let's say you want to use your existing black and white printer. You might be able to use that too, depending on whether or not you can use GHS label software with it to minimize your typing. Many companies now provide rolls or packs of GHS red diamond pictograms so you can adhere that red diamond pictogram to your existing black and white label. That's a perfectly acceptable solution to OSHA as well. And then lastly, if you're really in a bind as a temporary solution, where you just need a few labels in a pinch, you can get blank GHS labels where you can handwrite in your chemical and hazard information as well as add those pictogram labels. Just know that the writing's got to be legible and it's got to be in English. Okay, so in terms of best practices, take an assessment of your labeling needs, as Scott mentioned. Look at your chemical inventory, estimate your annual label volumes, minimize confusion in training by having your workplace labels match your primary shipped labels or your incoming chemicals. Assign an individual responsible for managing this transition in your facility, and research your options, implement and test your labeling solution before the deadline, and add written updates to your existing HazCom program. All right, so now what I want to do, we've got about, it looks like 12 minutes left. I want to cover just a couple of common industry questions and answers, and then we'll open it up for further questions and answers from the group. We'll take a look at what's coming in from the chat. All right, so with labels, can we X out or leave blank unused diamonds, pictograms, on our labels? OSHA responded regarding primary container labels that it's not permitted to leave diamonds blank, X them out, or indicate that there's not a pictogram. Their argument was that it promoted confusion. You can, however, completely black out an unused or not applicable diamond. You just have to cover the entire diamond area. Second question was, are pictogram labels with adhesive backing compliant? So if you buy a bunch of pictograms on a roll of labels, are they compliant? Yes, provided that they're large enough to be clearly visible. SDS sheets. When do you have to replace your MSDS sheets with SDS sheets? As soon as you receive them from your supplier. The employer is responsible for making the most recent SDS sheets received available. The other question is, would you get cited if you have MSDSs after the deadline? No, OSHA indicated they will not issue citations for the maintenance of MSDSs when SDSs haven't been received. You are encouraged, however, to request SDSs from your supplier, but it's not required. Here's a question that I didn't have a slide on, but you might be thinking about. Can MSDSs be stored on a computer to meet the accessibility requirements of HazCom? If the employee's work area includes the area where the MSDSs can be obtained, then maintaining MSDSs or now SDSs on a computer would be in compliance. If the MSDSs can be accessed only out of the employee's work area, and there you got to kind of define what is the employee's work area. Is it your entire plant? Is it just the work cell that they're in, et cetera? Then the employer would be out of compliance. So they have to have readily available SDSs. All right. Another question. Are hard copies of SDS sheets required? OSHA says electronic copies are permitted. However, you must have a backup system in the event of a power or equipment failure of the primary system. If your computer database goes down, your server stops functioning, you have to have a backup system. Employees must be trained on how to access and print hard copies if needed, and hard copies must be immediately available to emergency responders, emergency personnel. So technically it's not mandatory, but it is a best practice to continue to maintain hard copies as a backup. It's easy, it's quick, and it's not very costly at all. All right, here's another question that came into us this month. We're a research lab on an agricultural campus that includes 6 buildings. Our lab mixes chemicals and walks them over to an adjacent building for storage and later use. They're not sold to someone else, and we don't have to technically ship them. We just walk them over. What label do I need to use? So I posed this to my contact in Washington, D.C., and received kind of a qualified non-official response. They often provide responses that are guidance directed, but if it was official, then they'd have to publish it for everybody. So they responded that all containers moved from one facility to another must be labeled in accordance with F1, meaning the full 6 label elements of your primary container or shipped container label. So you need to have all of that information on that, even if you're just walking it across to another facility. Because it's leaving your facility and somebody else is going to be receiving it, they have the right to that same access to all of the hazard information as you did when the chemical came into your facility. So just know that. That same lab also produces a waste product from a mixture that gets stored later and picked up. What label is required for that byproduct waste? Here, OSHA's HazCom GHS does not cover that area because that's really covered by the EPA under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. So therefore, you'd label it with a HazWaste label. All right. Chemical mixtures, like the lab example, if you mix, reformulate chemicals for external use, you need to satisfy and you need to classify and label it by June 1, but your upstream supplier has not provided the new SDSs to you yet. What do? This was a petition by OSHA, or to OSHA by 9 industry associations. OSHA responded that their timeline doesn't change. However, they will manage it on the enforcement side if you use reasonable diligence and good faith efforts, meaning that they will not issue citations provided you pursue that. And reasonable diligence and good faith has been clarified to mean documented efforts to obtain the necessary information from your suppliers, provide a written account of the correspondence, and you've attempted to use alternate sources to find that information or classify it yourself. They may, however, OSHA may, however, decide to pursue your upstream supplier for further enforcement action. All right, and then the same holds true for distributors. I won't cover this slide, but know that if you're not receiving the information because your distributors haven't received the updated information, just use the reasonable diligence and good faith efforts, and you should generally be okay. It's a big change for industry. Everybody recognizes that, and OSHA is providing a little bit of latitude because of that. Okay, so with that, let's open it up for questions. Kyle, that's all I had to present, so have we had any questions come in?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you both for that great presentation. Before we get to the Q&A, I want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey I mentioned at the top of the hour. The survey should be appearing on your screen now, and we ask that you consider completing it to let us know your thoughts. The input you give us on this evaluation survey goes directly to improving future webcasts. So please do take the time to fill out the survey. If you don't see the evaluation survey on your screen, make sure your pop-up blocker is turned off. Now let's dive into some questions. First of all, since GHS is a globally harmonized system, it's right there in the name, are SDSs valid worldwide?
Good question, Kyle. No, they are not. GHS is really a voluntary international system that implements a framework for standardizing compliance regulations, such as converting MSDSs to SDSs. Countries, really, like the U.S., have the option to adopt and implement it freely, which creates varied transition deadlines, right? More specifically, only competent authorities such as the EPA, OSHA, or Health Canada in Canada have the authority to decide which GHS building blocks to incorporate, which is dependent on the needs of their target audience and the competent authority. So it's really folks like OSHA and Health Canada that determine the implementation of GHS internally within the country that they're responsible for.
Okay, great. We have several questions about secondary containers, and I'll get to one right now. So this comes from a company. They have small secondary containers that won't fit the matching primary label. What do they need to do to comply?
For secondary containers, if it doesn't leave your facility, you can use the workplace label, meaning you can use the current HazCom 1994 label, or you can use the chemical identifier, words, pictures, symbols, in combination with the other info, kind of conveys all of the physical and health hazards of the chemical. Remember, the goal of OSHA is to convey with the pictograms the physical and the health hazards of that chemical. So here I would suggest, the following practical accommodation that they've issued for primary labels, which is include the product identifier, the chemical name, for example, the signal word, as well as the pictograms on that small vial or small container, and then have the manufacturer's name or phone number on where they can get additional information. But again, because it's a secondary container, OSHA leaves it a little bit more broadly up to the employer to define what that is, and then the employer has the responsibility for making sure their employees are trained on how to interpret and use that label. Good question.
Okay, great. And we've gotten several questions about compliance and fines and violations. And you touched on this toward the end of your presentation, but I just kind of want to reiterate. Do we have any idea when fines will be assessed for companies who are found not to be in compliance?
That's a good question. Everything that I've read is it sounds like OSHA is trying to provide employers, because they know that this is such a big change, they're trying to provide guidance and information and direction to employers to get in compliance with some latitude for documenting things if they're not in compliance because of things out of their control. So, but I do not know what the level of fines would be or citations may be. Scott, do you have any clue on your end?
No, I mean, you hit on it with the reasonable, diligence on trying to get like SDSs. They are, citing for training requirements that have already already taken place. But as far as anything else, I'm with you. That's about all I know.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
So I guess the message here is do everything you can in your power to get in compliance, so that doesn't even have to be a concern.
Yeah, for sure. And if they do have questions about that, remember OSHA is divided up into regional offices, and I believe there's regional guidance officers and people that are there to help answer questions like that when it comes specifically to OSHA. So don't hesitate to contact the local OSHA office or the regional office for guidance as well.
Okay. We have time for one last question here, and I believe this is in reference to records being kept on site. Does it have to be an active inventory or just a list of chemicals on site?
Scott, why don't you take that one?
So I guess active inventory, not exactly sure what that means, but it should definitely be a living inventory. So it should be an accurate inventory of all chemicals on site. So when something new comes in, that should be added to that inventory. So there really shouldn't be a wait time or anything like that. So, I guess I interpret that as a living inventory. But that inventory is that list of chemicals on site, and, best practice should also have, the location where those chemicals are used on site so you can build your training employee information program on that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Scott. And one other thing that came up with regard to that was if you have chemicals, let's say, that maybe are not active, that you're not actively using on a daily basis, but you may have brought them in a year ago or 2 years ago, you still need to have your MSDS sheets for that chemical. So if it hasn't been replaced with a new chemical, the MSDS sheets are still valid, and those would apply. OSHA said you can still continue to use those. It's only when you're getting a new shipment of that chemical after June 1 of 2015 that now you have to replace that old MSDS sheet with an SDS sheet. So you can keep if it's a kind of an inactive chemical is what I was kind of interpreting from the question, that if you have your MSDS sheets for that, it's still valid. So yes, keep those on hand as well, as long as you have that chemical within your facility.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I apologize. We didn't get to everyone's questions, and there were a lot of questions that came in. But please understand that all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded on to our speakers who can get back with you. Once again, I hope you take the time to fill out the evaluation survey on your screen to give us your feedback. And with that, that concludes today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Tom, Scott, Brady, and everyone who listened in. Thank you, and have a great day.